the best horror movies can't be made because the sorts of things you can do in a book, you simply can't do in a film.
Hey everyone, this is Let's Play, where we cover the intersection of literature and video games. Today we're going to dive into writing horror stories with two very special guests. First we have Steve Goss. He's the Chief Creative Officer at Supermassive Games, who you may know from their amazing choice-driven horror games like The Quarry, The Devil in Me, the casting of Frank Stone, and the recently remade Until Dawn. And leading this conversation is our resident horror expert at Penguin Random House, Brandon. Thanks for doing this, Brandon.
Absolutely. So, I'm an marketing assistant at Penguin Random House, but I also have been doing freelance writing in the horror gaming space for about 5 years now. I've interviewed Steve before, I think for The Devil in Me and The House of Ashes. Great team. Always love chatting with them. And great games too. I love the choice-based games. And so when Jonathan approached me about doing a kind of Halloween special for the Let's Play channel, I was thinking about what could fit well with kind of something in this literature space, something in this like writing space. And the games that Supermassive puts out felt like a really seamless kind of like the best case for this video, because a lot of it feels like reminiscent of those like choose your own scare R.L. Stine books, like those the choose your own scare books. I remember being a kid and like you're marking out all the pages as I go to find all the endings in those choose your own adventure books, and that's always what those Dark Pictures and Until Dawn and games like that always feel like to me. So I'm really happy to be here with Steve. And Steve, just to give it just to what I'd love to chat with you about. There's a lot of exciting stuff going on, I think, right now in the horror space in general, with just like the blurring of lines of mediums. And that's another thing that I think that games like the Dark Pictures Anthology and Until Dawn do really well. It's blurring the lines of like horror movie and horror video game. And I know your team has been on the record before saying things like your games are almost like putting yourself in the director's seat and kind of choosing what happens in these games, almost like a movie. And so I'd like to chat with you more about like how books might fit in that space too, and maybe your inspiration, how literature has inspired you with these games as well. I thought I'd do an easy layup question. What's the scariest book you've ever read, if you can remember, or the scariest book or book that's left the biggest impact on you?
Crumbs. So I will have to preface this with, I do read. I read quite a lot, and I've always read, and I have a house full of books. So the scariest book I've ever... It's relative. It's when you read it. That's the thing that always impacts me. It's where you are and where on your journey you are and how that intersects with you. So I'm afraid I'm going to the... Depending on your opinion, I'm going to go to the top of the pile. I'm going to go with the things that have scared me the most when I first started getting into reading horror literature would have to be Stephen King. It's always going to be Stephen King. I do apologize. Everything in hardback on day of release. And it was probably Salem's Lot, just because it's creepy as fuck.
Yeah, agreed. That's cool.
I mean, it's simple as that. It was one of those things where I had no real expectations of it. I wasn't particularly familiar. I think I'd read one other book of his. I think I'd read Firestarter maybe previously. I can't quite remember. And I went into Salem's Lot before watching the TV show with David Soul, which I absolutely loved. But I went into that, and it was like, oh, this is a different type of horror story. Oh, this is all really quite unpleasant. And I love that. And then I always think of its twin book, which is like Needful Things, which is another King kind of story. Personally, not quite as terrifying, but kind of as a sandwich, those things. Yeah, really, really creepy horror. Although I have, of later years, become really addicted to John Connolly's work, the Charlie Parker series, which I know they're thrillers. They're not thrillers. They're properly twisted.
That's the whole conversation in itself. What's a horror versus a thriller? Yeah. Personally, I think they're the same.
Yeah, but those have been really plucking at my my horror strings recently. Again, bang up to date. Read far too many.
Yeah, that tracks too. In House of Ashes, there's the big vampire element of that game, and I remember discussing with you before. your inspirations for some previous titles. I don't know, for House of Ashes, you'd referenced a couple movies. I think The Descent was one of them that you'd reference. And I was curious if maybe, I don't know, for The Devil in Me, you referenced like classic slasher films were a big inspiration for that game as well. I was curious if books have played a really pivotal role at all in inspiration on your teams and as well.
I always take the view that storytelling is storytelling, and the delivery medium is somewhat agnostic to that as a kind of a process. I love horror movies, obviously. I wouldn't make movies that you can play if I didn't enjoy that structure. I love film, studied film, absolutely adore that. But the best horror movies can't be made because the sorts of things that you can do in a book, you simply can't do in a film. It's just not possible. It's either it would be insane, or it would just be, there are things you just can't put on screen. Even Terrifier 3 is nowhere near as grisly as many horror books. It really isn't. And it's kind of like, oh, okay, yeah. Each medium has a kind of a level of representation possible within it. And whilst I do love horror movies, and all horror movies, kind of in a kind of a slightly generic kind of way, I just consume them. I find that kind of to scare me, to horrify me. Last night I was up until 2 a.m. and I still didn't finish the damn book, but I couldn't put it down. Whereas actually I get a bit annoyed when a movie goes over 2 hours and I'm going, oh, come on, get on with it. So there's kind of a really different relationship. And I think for me personally, I think for a lot of the creative leadership within the studio that, fall under my care, we don't prioritize one medium above another. We don't go, oh no, we're just as likely to reference some old EC comic as we are the latest Jordan Peele movie, as we are John Carpenter, and as we are, a strange TV show from the 1970s. And also we talk about books, because I don't think you can talk about horror. You rewind, you go back to The King in Yellow, you go back to Lovecraft, August Lerth, a whole kind of, they are seminal ways of telling horror stories. Whether it's classic ghost stories, M.R. James, etc. They happened before we had moving pictures kind of doing it. Don't get me wrong, I love films, I'm not knocking films, but there are kind of core works which are very important to underwrite the kind of idea of what horror is and what types of horror there are. And I think it's very important to be a student of all of that material. I think if you're going to put yourself out there and pretend that you know what you're doing, you need to have some backup. It's quite helpful to have some kind of knowledge. And I mean, personally, I probably read more than I watch now, because there's many more books than there are films in this genre. And I can kind of dive back into books and then just nice and easy. I'm lazy.
I feel like the beauty of a lot of the Supermassive games is it's like everything all in one, because it's like a movie. It plays like a movie, but you're also in control. But then there's also a big reading element in it too. And I was just playing the Until Dawn remaster, and I forgot how when you're uncovering with the lore of the Wendigo and what happened in the mines and all, a big piece of that is you're just picking up clues and kind of reading about, like, you're reading these old, like, reading diaries, and you can see the, like, person kind of, like, the deterioration as they're succumbing to the curse of the Wendigo, and it's like everything all in one at that point. And I think that's really, really exciting. And that kind of goes back to what I was saying about, like, blurring these lines of horror media, and I think that's kind of their approach that I think a lot of genres are on, but horror is kind of ahead of the curve on right now, is like blurring the lines. It like a video game isn't, people used to kind of, I think, scoff at video games and be like, oh, it's just like you're unplugging your brain a bit. But I feel like that's not really the case anymore. And especially with games like this, it's like you have to do a lot of the work to kind of figure out what's happening in these games. And yes. Is that really intentional? Is that why there's that clue system in those games? Is that why there's that big element of, or is it kind of trying to, like you said earlier, invoke this sense of, like, it doesn't have to be a jump scare. It can be something as creepy as reading an old diary and in the game and kind of seeing what's happening. I'm curious.
there are so many ways to engage with your fear, and your, your little chemical releases that you can trigger. Building dread and tension, building uncertainty, building ambiguity. These things start to undermine your relationship to the text that you're viewing. It's not unreliable narration, but it is your understanding of it. And I think that kind of, whatever game we make, and we make games, we don't write books, we make games, okay, we get that. But they are very metatextual, they are very, very layered. And actually, yes, that kind of, choose your own adventure kind of vibe, that was kind of what early adventure games on PCs were like, your King's Quests and that kind of thing. And I kind of do see us in some way. Yes, we're dark, and it's a little bit grim in places, and, your face will get torn off. That's okay, don't worry. But in that sense, we use very similar kinds of mechanics that adventure games are traditionally used. And you mentioned some kind of choose your own books. Because I is old. No, I haven't played those ones you mentioned, but I have played the original fighting fantasy books like Wizard of Firetop Mountain, that kind of stuff, or Warlock of Firetop Mountain. Sorry, Warlock of Firetop Mountain if you really look at UK. That kind of idea of making decisions, then going roll the dice. Oh, I'm dead. Go back to the start, try again. No, I'm not going to say, yes, I sat down and that was exactly what inspired us. But there is an element of that where that structure, turn to page 47, see what's happened, oh God, is actually part of the choices. Although we do try to equip you with a robust set of information prior to making the choice. What I never want to do is to give you a choice where you don't know the outcome. Now, that sounds weird. What do you mean you don't know the outcome? Well, actually, if you pay attention, we have told you what's going on. And I always, and actually we often do it textually. We often do it with text. Like you say, you can pick up clues and look at them, they're often written. Because that's a kind of a trope of kind of RPGs and that kind of stuff, isn't it? You find the scroll and all that kind of stuff. But I'll give you a really solid example of kind of how much it matters to us and how much actually text matters to us. So you've been playing the Until Dawn remake. Naughty of you. Go and play the original, please. However, at the start of the game, you're with Sam on the bus, and the bus stops and Sam gets off, and then the bus pulls away, and she walks forward into there's a gateway, and she follows that gateway up, and she eventually ends up at the lodge, where she has to go to the cable car and everything. But if you the camera pulls back slightly as you start to walk towards the gateway, and above the gateway says Blackwood Pines. Right, this will be the test of how well you know your horror books. There is a book written by Algernon Blackwood called The Wendigo.
Wow.
In that first game, the entire plot is given away.
Wow.
I have met one human who got it.
Wow.
So you're playing, if you play the casting of Frank Stone, the main antagonist character, apart from Frank, is a lady named Augustine Lieber. And if you know your Sons of Lovecraft, you'll know that those names are concatenated out of well-known Lovecraft authors. It's all there in front of you. Don't disguise it, and do it with the references to things that I always put Cthulhu in every game. There has to be Cthulhu in every. That's the rule. But because I love those texts, and those texts have always come with me, they've always been part of my language of horror. And I don't think they wear out. I think they're fun. And they also give people different ways into the experience. If everyone only ever played games or only ever watched movies, it'd be a fairly monocultural conversation, I think. And horror is such a broad genre as well. It's such an open space. People come to it from all different directions. People come at it from the desire to perform within it or to consume it and a whole range of other things. And that makes it an interesting space.
Yeah.
That didn't answer any of the question, I do realise.
No,
But
it was
kind
excellent.
of is.
Yeah. Meanwhile, it took me getting attacked by the Wendigo and until Dawn to be like, "Oh, it's Wendigos," not picking up on that. No, that's amazing. I love that. I love it, and just like the sense of foreshadowing, and you kind of touched on something even when you were mentioning when you're playing as Sam, and all throughout all the games, it's like the way the cinematography works. You know, the way, and it kind of goes back to what I was saying. It's these blurred lines where video games, you know. It used to be like more first-person kind of games, and then the camera started to evolve over the shoulder, and now you have a point where like you can really analyze the cinematography of an entire game. I thought House of Ashes was great with that, and like the way that the camera really evokes the sense of how large that underground cavern really is, just because you have these really wide shots, and then like the characters look so small, but those shots are so wide, and it's interesting. Like
Yes. Cinematic language is extraordinarily important. And again, we're going back to that metatextual nature of the complexity of the image. You know, honestly, if cinema had been first person, I suspect we wouldn't be watching films. It's absolute. I mean, don't get me wrong. No, I do play first person games. I don't tend to make that many of them. I think there's a really interesting space for them, particularly in horror. I do get there's a very particular space in horror where inhabiting the avatar really heightens the sense of presence. So I think that, but I'm kind of in a more general sense, in a more your general running around shooting people kind of experience. I've never really gravitated towards that creatively because I like the language of film. I like the objectification of the lens. I like the way that you see. You connect to someone, but you connect to someone you can see. You have this kind of relationship, and it's that theatrical, that puppeteer, that relationship you have, and you experience through that character because you can see them. You can see all around them. You can see all of them. You can see their reactions to the world. So they tell you to be scared. They tell you to be excited. They tell you about the effort and energy to move, and whilst a kind of a third-person camera does some of that, as you say, it doesn't do the effects of, you know, isolating a character, giving you a sense of scale.
Yeah.
It doesn't do the things such as, you know, when your brain's about to explode, we go really close in on the eyeball so we can see it filling up with blood. That's quite hard to do in first person or with a traditional third-person camera. For us, it's an affordance to take you to those places. It's an affordance to give you identification with characters, and that's really important. We have to be able to frame the characters the way we want. We have to be able to treat them the way the frame needs to treat them, so that you get the relationship they have with others. And if you don't see that, it's very hard to read because you're not reading body language. You can't see it. And so many times our game's about relationships. So people say, "Oh, you make horror games, don't you?" Yeah, we do, but actually they're games about people in terrible situations with awful choices. And it's the contrast that's interesting. It's the as you said, thriller, horror, who knows? What's the you know, maybe if it doesn't have ghosts, it's not, you know, horror. Is it a thriller? I don't know. I mean, we all watch a lot of that kind of TV. True crime is massively dominant as a kind of source of material, but it often is and reads and plays just like horror. You know, we don't watch like a documentary on a serial killer without being horrified. You know, so we are constantly desirous to engage with things that are shocking and other, and I think kind of I like that because I can show you that with all the cinematic style that lets you understand the psychological position of the character. Plus, characters develop, and I think if you can't see a character developing, you can't build a relationship. So going back to, you know, we talked about, you know, books you love. The reason I read a lot, but the reason I read King, for instance, he just has just the best characters. I mean, I've read all these how to write books. I'm still blown away when you actually go, "Oh, you did that in 3 lines? Oh, Christ, how did you do that? Really? Oh, I don't know how to do that." And I think that's the thing for me.
Yeah.
It's got to be all about the characters, and therefore the cinematic presentation gives it to us.
Yeah, this is really, really interesting to hear as someone who has played the games, all the Supermassive games, because they are very character-driven games. And even thinking, okay, so Stephen King is your inspiration there, and thinking from like a book. If you have a book that's first-person perspective, it's a little bit harder to develop. Like you're having the main character is kind of the central relationship with everybody else. But in these games, they're always third person, and so you're able to see all of the relationships, how everybody is interacting. And to your point too about even just evoking a sense of fear to it, I'm thinking of Until Dawn when you're in the sanatorium as Mike, and you're walking at one point, you can see a Wendigo kind of crawling off the wall, and Mike doesn't see it, but you can see it, and that is so fascinating too, because it's like if this was first person, you would like. You would, if you saw it through first person, then Mike obviously would have saw it too. But there's something even creepier about the fact that, like, oh, I as the audience just saw that happen.
Yeah, the priority of image is really delightful, and it does mean we have to be truthful. I mean, we can never fib. The worst kind of stalks are those that lie to you. There's nothing, in my opinion, there's nothing worse than you're reading a story and a character does something, and later on it's revealed to be something completely different, and you're like, wait a minute, who narrated that? Is that who told me that fib about that? That's not good. I don't like that lying in narrative. And again, cinematic, the realism of cinema demands that you are truthful, or if you aren't truthful, you have an absolutely valid perspective why that wasn't seen or was seen. Whereas I think first or third person, they are reportage. They are almost documentary-like in their presentation. And that, I think, does change a bit the way that you can talk about characters. So I absolutely love being able to observe. And we do trick you. We do not quite show you everything. The camera doesn't quite frame things. You do know things the character doesn't, and the character knows things that perhaps you haven't interpreted correctly. But it's always true. It's just you might not be able to figure out which bits are true.
Yeah. So you bring up a good point, and I'm going to bring up, spoiler alert for Little Hope, because I'm going to get in the weeds of Little Hope right now. But when you bring up like the truthfulness to the player and the audience, that I feel like that game is so interesting because it almost is like a trick, I feel like, throughout the whole game. Or almost though, but if you read I feel like if you read the clues are kind of what will get you to that answer more quickly.
Yeah, it was interesting when we.
I feel like that's a really polarizing ending too of one of the games.
Yeah, so it came about in several. There were several kind of things we went through when we were thinking about that as a kind of a concept. The idea of a place that lets your personalities loose, where the components of the idea that you are not monolithic and actually are made up of different experiences. What happens if there was a place that would unchain that and let that through? And that was one of our conceits, was that was it is all true because the main character believes it. Yeah. So there's no dishonesty in narrative there. The narrator is not lying. They're just unable to. They're not confronting a reality. They're confronting their reality. It's their lived experience. Plus, we also, one of the things we did there was we actually went and looked at texts about the Salem witch trials. There's the odd famous play about them, apparently, which we looked into, and we quite liked the way that was used as a metaphorical resonance for. It's a story about the past, which is talking about the future in that kind of elevated horror kind of way, art horror kind of way. And so when you read, if you read the text, as it were, as you play, it is actually trying to it's not using it directly, but it is using a similar idea of the Salem witch trials as being metaphorical for a current situation. Which we kind of, like the Crucible, we liked that, we were inspired by that. So, that's quite high art by comparison with Stephen King, probably going, yes, the Crucible was a key, but it was something, we all had kind of copies of it, and we were all reading it, and we were all trying to figure out, this is really interesting, how is this working on two levels simultaneously, and how is it staying to be a historical story, but yet maintaining its kind of contemporary relevance? How's it articulating that? So, and then we put the psychological layer on, which was the kind of key thing to explore for that character was those events, what they did to that character, and what the outcome of that was, and how actually in many situations we are different people. We wear different masks. We present ourselves differently to different people in different situations. You know, the way you talk to your partner compared with the way you complain to a waiter, it's not the same person. You know, you are taking a personality, you're taking a projection and using it to deal with a situation. And so that kind of fed into a whole bunch of that characterization in that game.
Yeah, I'm so happy we're on the topic of Little Hope. I feel like that was, of all Supermassive games, that was the one that I would look back on all the notes and clues and stuff the most. I think,
Right.
You ever hear the meme where it's like, what's your Roman Empire? They say, like, what's that, like, historical event that you think about all the time for some reason? Like people say, like, the Titanic is, like, their Roman Empire because they know a lot of facts about the Titanic. For me, that's, like, the witch trials. And I've read a lot of, like, not about the witch trials. And I think when I played Little Hope, I see your point where it was, like, the narrative is reflecting kind of where the witch trials now stand in society as it is now. Like the concept of a witch is a very, like, sensational kind of horror trope. But there's been reckoning nowadays where it's like these were innocent victims at the end of the day. There was hysteria that was driving a lot of this. And so I thought it was so fascinating how the narrative of that game is kind of like getting caught up in the hysteria, not facing reality, like coming up with an easy scapegoat with the sister, Megan. She was kind of the scapegoat in that game. It's kind of reflecting like the history there. And so when you said, like, I think there in the behind the scenes, your team talked about how you had read a lot of text and did a lot of research about the witch trials. And I feel like that really shined through in the game. I know we publish books. My one friend, Megan, is a second grade teacher, and she wanted kids' books for her classroom. And I saw we just published a book where it was about witches, but it was kind of reframing what a witch is like for kids so that they're not it's kind of just like introducing the witch trials earlier now as like these weren't really actually witches that were like eating children, like these were innocent. I was like, it's so interesting to see how the history is and the reframing of that history now is happening and like for earlier generations now too. So
a little bit of knowledge is a dangerous thing, clearly. And when you have a society, I mean, I think kind of one of the interesting things about witch trials and everything is the way that I think for a contemporary audience, again, and yes, the Crucible did it, but actually today I think it's incredibly poignant as well, where we see so much of what we believe is not true. So much of what we are fed is manufactured information, at best half-truth, and often deliberately untrue. But because of the way it's delivered, we believe in it. We believe it's in Wikipedia, or it's on YouTube, it's on Fox News or whatever. It must be true, and it's not. And something like the witch trials is a kind of a super microcosm of that, where kind of social hysteria and the desire to to other people made that happen. And you can look at society now here in the UK. God forbid that you're not authentically Anglo-Saxon for some bizarre reason. It's like, what do you mean? We've been invaded so many times. There's no authenticity here. But you can erect that narrative around that, and it becomes quite scary. So I think you can see how that as a metaphor for social dissolution and the control of society by those who have the soapbox, as it were. That's a really interesting kind of idea. And I'm not going to over-politicize things. I don't subscribe to that. But you could take a whole bunch of material and you can filter it and look at it against that as a kind of a paradigm and go, yeah, it's still true. It's still people saying things that aren't quite true. But within an environment of hysteria, it becomes more and more and more true. And so eventually, we have to stop and kind of think, what on earth is going on? I think Little Hope was a lot of it was about that in terms of, what is real, what is a story, What do you believe, and why do you believe it? And what are these awful outcomes that are being visited upon people in the name of what? Some kind of sanctimoniousness and some kind of, religious kind of perspective. But actually, it wasn't. It was nothing to do with religion. Like most of the things, it's to do with power and control. And religion was just used as the kind of the stick to beat people with. The people doing it they didn't believe those things. They were just trying to be in control. So I think it's a really fascinating thing. I think horror is a really great space for that as well. Because obviously, because it has the fantastical element to it, you don't have to confront necessarily the realities. So I can see why something like The Crucible really worked, because it allows that narrative to pivot from the fantastical to the real and back again, and use history as a lens to re-discuss a modern situation.
Going down the list of the games now, I'm thinking of The Devil in Me. H.H. Holmes, was there any specific textual inspiration for that game as well? Or I know that you said slasher films in the past was a huge inspiration for that one.
There are a lot of things that inspired not just a game, but also the moments in the game. I mean, we're all terribly good thieves, aren't we, creatively? I mean, let's be honest. There are a finite amount of really original ideas, and it's also very subconscious. We all kind of inadvertently aggregate. We're all doing what AI does. We're all aggregating lots of bits of information and kind of storing it. So yes, I mean, absolutely love a good slasher movie, and particularly historically more older ones, the late 70s, early 80s ones. So yes, there was an element of that in there. But actually, I think for us, the fascination was, and it's just like, so Man of Medan, there was a legend of a ship called the Orang Medan. Okay. A Little Hope, we used the witch trials as a kind of a backdrop to those events. The Devil in Me, H.H. Holmes. I mean, first proper serial killer. What's not to be interested in? A guy who built a whole hotel to kill people. Pardon? I mean, really? How do you get away with it? Well, because no one could see if someone would be that evil. No one could see that was a possibility. So I think that was fascinating from that point of view. And it very much fits in with the fact that every one of our games has some element of either kind of historical or mythological connection that's already out there in the world. We invent a lot, but Wendigos are a thing in terms of a legend, yeah? They're a legend. And H.H. Holmes is a thing. He's a real thing. It must be the devil in me. That's just something he said. So we were fascinated by that. We were fascinated by the idea of a genuinely evil person. But then what we wanted to do was talk about, why would someone want to repossess that? Why would someone want to become that? Is that a mask, or a mask they could wear to permit them to behave in a certain way? And how many killers are there trapped on that island? It's very fast moving, if you ask me.
Yeah.
Yes. Each of them is quite a different tone. Each of them is quite a different kind of experience. Each of the games, whether that's Until Dawn, The Quarry, Dark Pictures, Frank Stone, etc. They're all quite kind of different, but they're all, for us, each of them is an opportunity to tell a new story, for new characters, to explore some other facet of a genre and a space that we love, but also, as I said, to go back and find new characters with new motivations. Some you love, some you hate. Sorry, can't please everyone. But hopefully all of them somewhat interesting, and some of them on real kind of journeys of rebirth and change, and some of them just spiraling down out of control. The cast of The Devil in Me are beset by their own demons, let alone the kind of re-invoked memory made live again of H.H. Holmes. That they're already in a lot of trouble before they get there.
Yeah. You bring up a meta element too that I think is really fascinating, where it's like they're a film crew that are kind of investigating this, and this goes back to a point I was going to make earlier too about how I feel like these games really kind of bring things back to light into like the cultural conversation for newer generations that, you know, may not be top of mind. So like the inspiration of Holmes, like for The Devil and Me, is like I knew so many people that never even heard about that. Like we're like House of Ashes. I know like there was talk about how The Descent had really inspired that, and then all these people were talking about The Descent now, and it's fascinating how like it will bring these things back in the conversation, how horror is kind of, it's like almost like a cycle. It's almost like these things are coming back in the cycle now. And I think games are huge for that. I think games are huge for, obviously younger generations play video games. Like I think I read a statistic once where it said Gen Z finds the number one outlet of entertainment is video games, then it's TV, and then so on and so forth. But it's fascinating how video games can kind of bring life back to these, you know, even old books and things like that, especially when you're drawing that inspiration from that source material. I see that even with classic art too, like even classic slashers like Michael Myers and things like that. I feel like video games, look at Dead by Daylight, and you know the way that they get like the new Texas Chainsaw Massacre video game. It's bringing life back to this classic horror and the elements that are so integral to the whole genre. Yeah,
and I think kind of there's an element of okay, so some of us are obviously old, and there is a kind of a whole bunch of things that interested me all through, you know, my kind of my teenage years and adulthood, etc. And I kind of want to share those enthusiasms with people, and so, you know, I'm very lucky that I can do that. You know, I think there's a conversation between creator and consumer, and that's you know, I consume other people's media, and I enjoy people consuming the media that I create, and I think that's a kind of a rewarding kind of cycle. I do obviously, you know, as a creator and a creative, I do worry when I kind of go to someone and say, "Oh yeah, well that's really related to this," and just get a blank expression and go, "Oh, you've never seen Friday the 13th, then?" No. Okay. You know, we were having a conversation. So we announced Directive 8020 a while ago, and we had it at Gamescom this year. And one of the little taglines was, "It's the thing in space." Yeah. Okay. How many people have watched The Thing?
they're like, what thing?
Yeah, and then I play the old fart card and go, "Oh, what do you mean the Howard Hawks original?" Pardon? What No, I mean the original. Which one? Which original do you mean? Oh, you mean the Carpenters? No, that is not the original. That's is it? What about the new one? Well, that's not actually the same story, isn't it? And you kind of you realise that there's, even within something simple, and you think kind of in my head, this vision, this is an anchor point. It's really simple. No. It's complicated, and I do think. I mean, I do hope that there are enough people who are interested in things to do that research and go wider and bring it back, because so much of what you really love is built on the love of other people's love of things. You know, they're assembling things from things they love, but of course, then you know, I refer to Stephen King. And whilst I'm not going to admit to plagiarizing anything of Mr. King's work, it has been hugely influential upon my thought process, yeah? But then, does someone who makes a game, or someone writes a book after playing the games that Supermassive have made, do they understand the references? Do they understand where it's come from? Or are they just students of the surface? And I do kind of think there is a thing where we kind of accelerate away from a lot of that source material, and we're also in danger of losing some of the creators. You know, Stephen King is quite an old chap these days. You know, how many more books is he going to write? He did say he was going to stop and then didn't. But do you know what I mean? And it's kind of like, how do you keep these things alive for people? You know, okay, H.P. Lovecraft, obviously a very, very horrible human being in real life. I would not want to meet him or his cat. But But I can't help but be fascinated by the material he created and the authenticity of the universe. And I read Stephen King, and I know Stephen King loves H.P. Lovecraft. I read his books, and I can feel it in what he says and does, the way he writes. So as a creative, I love. So, what horror films do you like? Yes, I mentioned the few that scared me, but I'm just as happy sitting down with Boris Karloff Frankenstein as I am. What did I watch this weekend? Autopsy of Jane Doe. Yeah. So equally valid for me to watch both of those things. And actually, if you've played Casting of Frank Stone, you may have seen in some of the bonus costumes some, all the horror movies. But because the genre's rich, and I think we should enjoy playing with it. We should enjoy the culture we've created and been created for us, and we should revel in it. I just want my biggest hope is that there are new writers and there are new filmmakers in the genre, and of course there are, but ever fewer. I kind of think. I think that's a thing, and it's how to get that material back into people's hands so they start. How many? I don't know how many people have bumped into. Never read any M.R. James. I'm like, really? You've never read? Never read any ghost stories? No.
Yeah. But in turn, there's a lot of people that have played a lot of, choose your own adventure horror video games, and there's a lot of older folks who haven't. And I think that's the really exciting thing about video games is that it is, like I mentioned earlier, I know it's huge for the younger generations, and it's that's the outlet now. It's instead of reading like a Stephen King book, by yourself, you're on Twitch watching somebody play Casting of Frank Stone, and that's kind of the experience now. And there's something to be said. Maybe you're losing something with that, but at the same time, it's kind of interesting to see how the genre moving forward.
I don't want to play the old fire card and say, "Oh, the youth of today don't know what they're doing." I think that's absolutely not true because culture reinvents itself. It's the same with language; it just gets reinvented and reappropriated, etc. But what I hope to do is at least transfer some of my things I like through the medium of the things I create and share them with other people. And that maybe that inspires them to go and look at some of those materials. Yeah. Obviously I'm very upset. I've only met one human being who got the massive clue I dumped at the start of Until Dawn. But then that's one. I've touched one. That's not bad go. And if that makes someone go and backward, what's that about? Oh, this, that, and do a bit of research. That's a bit of a win for me.
Nice. Yeah. How do you feel when there's a choose your own adventure horror novel based on a Supermassive Games? There's a novel. What? There's a choose your own novelization of something like Until Dawn. It's just that's the adaptation there.
That would be quite interesting. I think whether there be an audience for it. Having said that, I'm not going to name drop, but I do know some people very heavily involved in the creation of that genre, and they are releasing new books. And I think it's really fascinating, talking to them and kind of seeing what's happening, is that actually there is an audience. And of course, it's an audience of slightly older people who are returning to that material and then perhaps trying to evangelize them to their families, etc. So there is a virtuous cycle. I mean, it's not all doom and gloom. And, as a family, my family, for instance, yes, I've lots of books. I also have a gigantic film collection. And, we watch films on a very regular basis. And, okay, some of it goes over my kid's head, but my daughter's 21 and my son is 18. And our family movie is The Lost Boys.
Nice.
That's the film we always watch. And they both absolutely love it. Of course, you have to go to Santa Cruz, stand at the car park, which we did. But they absolutely love it. So I feel there is a transference, and I'm very happy to do it. And maybe the games are that. Maybe the games are the legacy that transfers my enthusiasms in other media around horror to the next generation, and they keep that alive. They keep wanting to be scared, and the fact that they're playing it, not watching it or reading it, is, as you say, it's a shift in consumption behavior. It's a shift in time. It's a shift in so many things. I remember starting making video games back in 1987. Oh, God. And I thought I'd maybe make them for 5 or 6 years and then I'd have to leave the industry because old people didn't make video games. Don't make video games. And then I met an MP the other day, a member of parliament. I was giving a lecture, I forget where, and I bumped into them. And of course, they're in their 50s. They represent a constituency in the UK, or whatever, and they're all that. And they play video games. And suddenly you're going to go, of course, yeah, all of us who grew up in like 1980, 77 to 84 or whatever as teenagers, we all played games. All of us were throwing coins into Donkey Kong and Frogger and what have you. It's inevitable that people now in positions of responsibility play video games, and it's become a shared common language, etc. I believe one of your presidential running mates is a video game and likes a bit of Crazy Taxi, apparently.
Oh, yeah, I saw that. I love it. I think it's great. I think that it's great that the conversation around games isn't like it's melting your brain. And to point I need at the beginning of this call, it's like when you play these games, like the games your team puts out, it's like when you take the time to read in the game, it's helping you. Like, and what's the difference between reading a bunch of stuff in this game and reading a book? I don't think there's much of a difference. You're still reading. It's still brain power. You're still trying to uncover the mystery. You're still trying to move forward. And so I love that the conversation is shifting around that, and it kind of connects. I'm not going to open this can of worms, but like elevated horror, I think that's a whole other it gets into all that kind of stuff too. But yeah, I think it's really exciting. I know people that have never watched a Friday the 13th movie, but have played the video game, and that's how they know about Jason. And it's like,
wow.
Like you should, but in that, I feel like people, when they watch the original movies, they think they're funny. They think that I keep seeing conversations right now about people that I think I saw a tweet where someone had brought their kid to watch the original Halloween, and they were saying it was more like a comedy now, and it's like, oh, that hurts my heart, but it's not a video game, so I don't know if it's having the same effect anymore.
Wow. But
Yeah,
then again, you've got tastes, shifts in culture.
Exactly. Yes.
Some of them are very hard to watch, if I'm honest with you. Some of them, I mean, I think less so with the writing. I always put a bracket around Lovecraft. Anyone would be foolish to not consider who he was, but there's also the things he created, and there is a bit of a, I'm not an apologist for people who behave badly, and I'm not suggesting that's a way forward, but products of their time. I mean, there is very little. It's very hard to rewrite history. Very hard to rewrite history. You can pretend it never happened. I get that. You can say, I don't want that to influence the present or the future. I get that too. But things happened, and yes, you watch some old horror movies, and you're like, really? That's just deeply inappropriate. That's just wrong. What? These teenagers, they appear to be grown adults. What the fuck's going on there? And all the weirdnesses that you suddenly realise were all folded into everything that you watched. You go and watch a TV program about a family, and you'll be looking at it going, the kids are as old as the dad. What's going on? And we don't have that anymore, because we believe more authenticity and more representation and more diversity in our performers is incredibly important, to be more reflective of us as an audience. Of course, I'm a chubby white bloke. I've never had issues of representation. I get that, and I don't want to be a spokesperson for it, but I understand why when you look at some of these older stories, you kind of go, really? That's just a mess. What on earth were they thinking? Why did they come from that position? But, rewind yourself back to 1976 and you're like, yeah, I get it. Yeah. It's dreadful.
In 50 years from now, people will be looking at this time and probably saying the same thing. We'll probably be learning.
Oh, yeah. We're a bunch of readivists with our terrible views. It's that moment, I think it's in Sleeper, Woody Allen, where he's either hidden in the orgasmatron or whatever, but he'd also discovered that cream cakes are health beneficial. Yeah? And he just goes absolutely berserk. Oh my God, they're healthy. They've discovered they're good for you. And it is that there is this absurdity, isn't it, that we the particularly with something as, I was in, what shop was I in? I was in one of these large booksellers with a big W the other day, and I actually picked up a really nice copy of The King in Yellow, really beautiful bound copy, and I read it. It's not the easiest read in the universe because it was written about 4 billion years ago, and the use of language is really, really kind of quite baroque. I think Lovecraft can be a bit difficult at times, but this was like super difficult. And I thought, it's a little bit of a shame that no one has because that story will become lost because people won't be able to engage with it. Is there a way of taking that and reimagining it? And I know, I think True Detective season 1 did quite an interesting job in terms of reusing that as a text, as it were. There you go. Thriller, horror, not quite sure. Was it supernatural? Was it real? I'm not quite sure, but it made a good TV show. But again, some of these things they're running out of runway as well. I don't think my kids would ever try to read my copy of The King in Yellow. They'd just probably get past page 1 and go, it's worse than Shakespeare, Dad. Not doing it. Out.
You brought up Directive 80/20.
Yep.
Anything you can reveal or any kind of, I know you mentioned some inspirations, anything very high level, very, very spoiler free level, anything you can speak to.
Each time we look at a game, we look at it from several angles. Have we got an interesting location? Is it an interesting world to explore? Have we got characters we were interested in? Is there obviously an interesting story to impart? But one of the things we do is we look at the structure of horror. We go and we look and go, okay, well, we haven't done a cosmic horror, or we haven't done a body horror. You could look at this and you could kind of go, yes, I can see the resonances of the thing, but I also kind of see some resonances of other narratives that you might not foreground quite as much, and that kind of, again, the whole kind of cosmic horror thing, the kind of the unknowable, unnameable kind of horror, about a thing that behaves in a way, like Color Out of Space, for instance. It doesn't hate humans, doesn't like humans. They're just things. They're just things in the world. So those kind of elements I think are really interesting. There's elements of things like Invasion of the Body Snatchers that are within that, and you can take that either in a McCarthyist, or you can take it in a kind of a mid-70s approach to the progressive views of our rights as different types of human beings that was kind of being discussed in that film. Men's roles, women's roles, society's roles, all these different things. Or you can go back to the original black and white and you can look at that as a kind of a treatment of the red under the bed kind of vibe. And then we can kind of use that kind of, again, coming forward and talking about kind of our sense of identity and authenticity around who we are and the increased freedoms we have to express ourselves. And that narrative, therefore, could resonate with audiences at all three of those junctures. So lots of kind of things in play. And I think that tagline we put out there, the thing in space, I think that kind of does set that kind of like line and go, okay, but experientially, we're playing with you. I think the correct term is fucking with you. But that's what we're doing. Yeah, we're fucking with you. And it is, I think, again, if you look at our game, there's often there's a twist, isn't there? There's oh my God, it's a slasher, it's a psychopath in a mask. No, it's a legendary cannibal creature living in the dark of the caves under the mountain. Okay, it's a group of kids off on a boat, whatever, crash into this thing. Oh my God, it's full of horrors. Actually, it's some terrible, terrible experimentation done in the name of warfare. Oh my Lord, how does that mash together? And so we kind of have that switching up. We have that kind of undercutting of things. And some of them operate on a narrative level, and some of them operate on a kind of a gameplay level. But I think part of that is also to try and keep players on their toes, to not give them that sense of, I think horror does, if a good horror story does that really well. It's not quite what you expect. You think you've got it, You think you've got it by about halfway through, and then by halfway through the rest of the half, you go, it's not that, is it, bugger? It's something completely different. Oh, I've lost grip. Oh, what's going on? Oh, someone's opened the trapdoor, we're falling. And I think that kind of thing. So we've very carefully described what it is at the moment. We've shown some elements of it. There are a lot more elements within that story that I think they feed into that main thematic, the main themes around, the idea of, if you think about the thing, who is real? Am I real? Am I tending to be someone? Am I an amalgamation of people? Is who I am a product of my history, my family, etc.? When you think about the thing, yes, I get it's all the body horror, it's all the alienness, etc. But actually it's discussing a lot of other things on a range of textual levels around identity and what it is to be who you are or think you know who you are. And I think you'll find that Directive 8020 plays with those themes in quite an interesting and rich way. For me, one of the lovely things about making games in this genre is there's so many people who really enjoy it, and they actually quite, I don't say intellectualize, but they're quite open to the discussion of that.
Yeah.
And I think that's really rewarding, whether they're fans or whether they're people such as yourself involved in the world. So yeah, we're always here. We're always happy to chat. There's stuff I'd like to talk about.
Awesome.
It's a line.
Yeah. So read the chat. Thanks again. I really appreciate your time.
No worries.